Welcome, everybody. I'm Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm a professor of public policy and governance at the University of Amsterdam. I'm also the academic director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, which together with SPUI25 is organizing this series. So this, as you may already know, is the first of 5 virtual visions of Europe events dealing with what we're calling pandemic politics and corona crisis response. And the concept of the series is that we bring together a number of scholars from ACES, from the University of Amsterdam, together with prominent external expert guests to talk about different aspects of the current corona crisis. So we're starting tonight with public health. Next Wednesday at 8, we will deal with socioeconomic policy responses. Then we will have a session on national and European politics, then one on geopolitics, and we will conclude on the 27th of May with a session called Whither the EU, on the implications of the crisis for the European Union and European integration. So let me briefly introduce tonight's speakers and also just explain a little bit about more about the format. So we have 4 speakers. The first speaker, who also organized the panel, is Maria Weimer. Maria is Associate Professor of European Law at the University of Amsterdam. Her work focuses primarily on risk regulation. She's written a couple of pieces recently on the COVID pandemic with some of the other participants here. The second speaker is Aniek de Ruyter. She is also Associate Professor of European Law. She's an authority on EU health law and public health, on which she's published a recent book, and she's been very active in the public and also academic debate about the pandemic. Our third speaker will be Alessio Paces, who's Professor of Law and Finance, also at the University of Amsterdam, and Director of the Amsterdam Center for Law and Economics. And he is very much a law and economics scholar who will approach the pandemic from that point of view. And finally, we're very happy to have as our special outside guest, Scott Greer. Scott is Professor of Health Management and Policy, Global Public Health, and Political Science at the University of Michigan. He's published a number of books on different aspects of EU health, law, and policy, but also on comparative federalism, which will inform his angle. Okay, here is the format. Each of the speakers will have 7.5 minutes, and I'll try to hold them very strictly to time. Then they'll each have 2 minutes to react to what the others have said, and then we will open up to you, the audience, and I will ask you either to put up your hands in the participant window or to send a message to me in the chat window, and then I'll take you in groups of 3, and you know, when I recognize you, Lisa, our technical host, will open up and we'll give you the floor. We'll unmute your microphone. I will ask you to be short and to the point and ask a question, and not to give a long comment, as we don't have that much time. And then I will selectively give the panelists a chance to respond. And I hope that we'll be able to take 2 or 3 rounds of questions, because we'd really like to make this interactive. We know that people don't just want to listen, but also to interact under these circumstances. So Maria, the floor is yours, and I'll warn you when you have 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this panel tonight. Now, I'd like to submit to you an idea that hopefully we can discuss. And because one cannot do much in 7 minutes, the way that I formulate this idea will necessarily be reductive, not do full justice to the complexity of the issue, and will be phrased somewhat provocatively. So here's the idea. I argue that for the most part, the EU does not need more legal powers to act in public health emergencies. What the EU does need is to better use the powers that it already has at its disposal to do mainly two things. One, to facilitate the coordination of national public health measures, and two, to mitigate the negative effects of different national measures on free movement and other core values of the Union, such as solidarity and fundamental rights. Now, that means that to accomplish this, we need political will, above all, on the part of the member states that have to come together and follow a common European framework of criteria and principles that underpin public health responses to COVID-19 at the national level. So I argue that the difficulty we are facing, and by that I mean the difficulty we've seen in the initial phase with coordinating national responses, and now we are seeing again with coordinating the kind of exit measures that are being taken at national level, and more generally difficulties with cooperation and solidarity, that these difficulties, they're not a problem of European law, they are a problem of European politics. So let me explain this as brief as I can. There is, of course, a paradox at the heart of the EU's response to COVID-19. So one could argue this is the hour of Europe, a crisis where Europe would be forged, as Jean Monnet would say. So tackling transboundary problems like a pandemic, like a virus that doesn't respect borders, is precisely the kind of task the EU was born to do. Yet what we are seeing right now is the power of member states. We see national leaders and, interestingly, national science advisors talking to their national publics, showcasing their decisive or less so leadership. The EU is not even mentioned. So naturally, this is perceived as a weakness, as a weak EU right now. But this is not entirely fair to say that the EU is weak. We know, of course, that there is a competence issue here. We know that member states in the treaties, the founding documents of the Union, have limited the powers of the EU to act in public health emergencies, and they have limited them to a supporting role. Instead of criticizing the EU for being weak right now, why not commend the EU for sticking with competences for once? Why not commend the EU for respecting the legal limits to European integration? Some would then ask, well, don't we need a treaty change? Once this is over, don't we need to give the EU more legal powers? Here again, I want to be more cautious. Yes, some things will have to change, but overall, there are good reasons why health policy is a national policy. There is what I call a legitimate diversity, which has to do with different healthcare systems, different political systems, federal structures at national level, and not to mention the fact that the virus does spread differently across the member states. So there is no one-fits-all solution here. And so we are faced with a legitimate diversity, and the EU has to respect this, and it has been respecting this. Yet, there is a caveat to my argument. I recognize, of course, that there are problems that arise when national measures are not coordinated and when member states behave selfishly. Alessio and I just published a paper showing the price we are currently paying for diversity. First and foremost, the damage that is being done to core values that underpin the Union. free movement, cooperation, solidarity, fundamental rights. And there are also potentially very dangerous economic effects that come from this lack of coordination. And as we go forward, the lack of coordination of the different relaxations of lockdowns. So coordination is crucial. And the EU offers tools for that. There is an EU legislation in place precisely for that purpose. Now the question is there sufficient political will at the national level to use these tools and to coordinate better? Right now, the most pressing issue is, of course, with regard to the exit, to the relaxation of lockdowns. The Commission has issued guidelines formulating criteria and principles that should underpin national health responses. So the Commission has done its part in this. The question is, will member states follow this? And if they do, will they give the EU credit where credit is due? Will they, for instance, harmonize the data and the approaches to how they measure the contagion, to how they measure death and mortality rates? Will they coordinate on tracing and tracking? And the EU, of course, has a role to play in this, and it does play a role in this. It also has competencies in other areas, above all in the internal market, and it should use these powers more decisively to, for example, prevent abuse in the way that member states are imposing border restrictions. And there is research showing that not all of what has been done is necessary for public health protection, and there's a lot of problems with non-discrimination and fundamental rights at the border. So, to conclude, what I think the EU does not have enough of right now is a European political space, a public that would demand action from national governments that is oriented towards European health, European solidarity, rather than towards national politics. Or perhaps the problem is with national leaders who are thinking short term and fail to show citizens the added value of the European Union right now. Either way, I don't think that more legal powers will solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Perfect to time, clear argument. And now I want to call on Aniek, who may have some different things to say about the legal dimension of the EU response. Aniek.
Yes, thank you very much, Jonathan. And thank you, Maria, for that very clear argument, which it's hard to disagree with, of course. And we've written some on this together as well. But I do want to bring in a little bit more of the law rather than the politics. And I want to talk about three things. And by the way, good evening, everybody, as well, here from Bergen, North Holland. First is that I want to talk a little bit about the background of the current EU power and the legal basis that is already there, and that have actually undergone relatively recent changes. The second thing I want to talk about is give you two examples of one where the EU is now really doing a lot better than it did before, and another example where I think the EU can do a lot better. And then third, I want to talk a little bit about what would be really needed to have an efficient or an effective EU response to a large outbreak. And that would encompass, I think, a lot more than just political will. It would need capacity and legal powers. But it is the question, of course, I mean, law always follows politics, if that's really what we would want. So first, when we talk about countermeasures to a large-scale cross-border threat to disease, there's a very specific legal basis in the current EU treaty. And it's relatively recent. It only has come in 2008 when the Lisbon Treaty was made some amendments to the then existing treaties. But at the same time, some of the current EU's powers can be traced back to the very beginning of the EU in the coal and steel community, where there were already disease programs, etc. When in the 80s, we had HIV/AIDS. That's when really the member states started to coordinate and work together, particularly on expertise, and create some sort of an EU public health presence. At the same time, there's also the WHO. So one of the things that Maria said is that, you know, the EU is really there for these types of issues. Actually, the EU is not at all there for these types of issues, I would say. That's what we have the WHO for, except that in the context of EU lawmaking and EU policy making, it's very hard not to do anything on communicable diseases and on health. And this is what happened over time. Now, when then in 2001, we had the 9/11 attacks and anthrax attacks, that's when we saw that the EU started to become very much more thinking about what to do when there's a large-scale bioterrorist attack, what to do when there's a huge pandemic outbreak, which those types of events started to become increasingly present in the world. Then we had in 2003 and 2005, we had the bird flu outbreak, the SARS outbreak, and that's when member states were also starting to recognize, hey, we need to have, you know, more, a clearer legal power here. And this is also what brought on the whole discussion about a change in the treaty in Article 168 to say, okay, when there's a large-scale cross-border health threat, the EU needs to have some kind of legal power to do something about this that goes beyond the already existing surveillance and response mechanisms that was there for infectious diseases like HIV/AIDS. So what happened then is that now we have a treaty basis. This is the most important thing you need to start lawmaking in the EU. And then we had, and that was in 2008, and it only gave the EU, you know, relatively soft powers to coordinate and to create incentive measures. But now in 2009, we have the swine flu outbreak. So during that time, there wasn't any kind of real action yet to start lawmaking. But after swine flu, it was well recognized that the EU needed to create law to deal with large-scale pandemic outbreaks. And this happened only in 2013, after a whole host of whole lot of sort of evaluations on what went wrong during swine flu, which was a lot. So during swine flu, some member states had advanced purchase agreements with, for instance, pharmaceutical companies, and they bought up all the vaccines for the whole of the EU, which meant that some member states had tons of vaccines, paid way too much money because all the member states were played out against each other in terms of the price of the vaccines, and other member states had nothing. So during the swine flu, and this is the worst case scenario because you do not want to start coordination and lawmaking during the crisis, you want to do this before the crisis, all of a sudden some member states had to offload vaccines to member states that had nothing. So clearly, and there were lots of other communication issues. In some member states, people were getting 2 jabs for the vaccine. In other member states, they would have 1. There was a lot of miscoordination at the time. So this is why in 2013, a new decision was adopted that, for instance, on the issue of the availability of countermeasures, vaccines and antivirals, created some law. And this is where we are now. This whole mechanism is really in place right now. And it has brought, in my opinion, a lot of improvements. So now one of the things that, for instance, is going a lot better, still voluntary, still relatively soft, but is public procurement. So there are now a whole bunch of medical countermeasures that are bought in unison with groups of member states. So there, the distribution and the redistribution in the EU is going a little bit better. In the beginning, not so nice to Italy, but still, in comparison to what happened in swine flu, this really is a lot better, and the stakes are much higher now. So it is also a lot more difficult. What is still going really bad, I think, is communication. And this is also what is recognized by the health security community in the EU, is that it looks a lot like there's really bad coordination at EU level, but a lot of this is also very bad coordination of communication across member states. So this is something I think that really there can be a lot of improvement. Now, my last point, also for the sake of time, is what would be the implication of more and better EU coordination? So if we would really want to do a lot better, the EU would need to build capacity at central level. So it would need to have money to create stockpiles, but it would also need to have the legal power to do so. At this point, if member states are not implementing preparedness plans that the EU creates, there's no way to launch an infringement procedure to force member states to do so. So there's no legal power to do that either. So we would need more legal power to do this. And then you cannot ask member states to prepare better and to build a better public health capacity if you're not offering anything in terms of funding, in terms of expertise, etc. And there is no redistribution in the field of health at EU level right now. So this would mean we would almost start creating an EU healthcare state, an EU welfare system. And this is indeed, in agreement with what Maria said, probably a bridge too far.
Thank you, Aniek. A lot of interesting ideas there, some of them reinforcing what Maria has said, and others opening up space for discussion. So I turn it over to Alessio, who I know is going to talk about the costs of non-coordination. Alessio.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone, particularly to Maria for bringing me in this. And well, good evening, everyone. I think I'll be different from my predecessor in two respects. First of all, I'll speak about a little bit of economics of this diversity that we observe. And second, I'll be a little more pessimistic about the status of things. I want to make 3 points tonight. First, diversity of policies towards this epidemic create negative externalities, spillovers, if you want to call them this way. Second, the political economy at the national level undermines learning from this diversity. And I'll illustrate this with a typical misconception about so-called trade-off between debts and dollars, between protecting health and protecting the economy. And third, actually not whether or not what, how can the EU coordination remedy all this? First point, cross-border externality. The heterogeneity of local preferences towards health policies is the main fundamental reason why diversity is something we can't avoid in this kind of policies. Okay, there are different preferences toward risk. They differ per country, they differ per region. There are different enforcement mechanisms. There are some countries in the EU that enforce policies by way of recommendations. Other countries, the majority, use fines. The compliance with these policies varies enormously across countries. So there's a very strong reason to keep this diversity, but there are high costs of this. The high cost is what in economic terms we call externalities. And in a sense, there is one way which is absolutely evident. Having different policies towards the epidemic creates negative externality to the extent the laxer policies have a high probability to export contagion. This is intuitive, and it's an intuitive solution, closing border or restricting transition across border, which seems innocuous at this stage, but hold on. Lockdown, containment policy will end, and border restriction may not end. Why this is still an externality? Well, workers that used to work cross-border are stuck. Tourists that used to travel all around Europe or around the world cannot do that anymore. Even if they're allowed to go for tourism somewhere, they may be prevented from coming back. And this all creates negative externalities to the economy of different countries in the EU, but also undermines, obviously, the sense of EU belonging. There is another problem that is less evident than undermining the free movement of persons. There is also another undermining of the one pillar of the European Union, which is the free movement of goods. Asymmetric policies of lockdown create scarcity of inputs. and this scarcity affects other countries. The reaction to this seemed to be straightforward, has been straightforward, has included export bans, the beginning of autarky, and may escalate towards more autarky. This is a failure in two respects. It's undermines economic efficiency, because we know that free trade and free movement of goods reflect the principle of comparative advantages, so that every input should be produced where it's most efficient to produce. And of course, the restrictions undermine this. But also, more importantly, it undermines European integration. The second point that I wanted to make is that one potential benefit of diversity is that diversity enables countries to learn from each other. We haven't seen that happening. And the reason why we don't see that happening is that there is a huge political economic problem. Politicians, in implementing these measures, containment measures, social distancing, and timing these measures, are captured by local interest. Depending on the phase of the pandemics or the epidemics in which we are, the probability they are captured by group rather than another varies. This is very well illustrated by a quote, if you want, the quote by Donald Trump: "We can't let the cure be worse than the problem." We could derive Donald Trump, but that doesn't change the fact that pretty much every country has used this argument. There's a trade-off between that and dollars. There's a trade-off between protecting the economy and protecting health. And on these grounds, most of the countries, including European countries, have delayed action. Now, there are ways to explain, to demonstrate, which in the interest of time we won't do, that this trade-off, even if it was to be taken seriously, would offer no ground to delay action towards epidemics. If you measure the value of life with a very coarse measure, it's the value of statistical life. It's very controversial. It underestimates a lot of things, particularly the value of life. Still, the comparison between the deaths that were averted by containment policy and the lost GDP doesn't add up. So containment was always a no-brainer. So why didn't it happen? Obviously, it didn't happen because before the problem stemming, the problem of congestion of hospitals and of intensive care unit became a salient problem, the local interests were dominating the political discourse. But most importantly, this trade-off is actually not the right way to look at the problem. It is conceptually wrong. There are a number of items, of consequences of the epidemics that cannot be quantified. And because of that, it is simply wrong to compare the benefit of saving life with the cost in terms of lost GDP. This is a problem recurring because now that in most countries of the world, of the European Union, the containment policies have had an effect, a positive effect. The question is, as Maria put it in the beginning, what is the next step? What is the exit strategy? And in this brings me to the third point I want to make to conclude. What is the way forward? The way forward, the way I see it, the way also in the article I wrote with Maria, we see it, is more EU coordination. The reason why more EU coordination would be beneficial, both economically and economically efficient, is that A, it will reduce the cross-border externalities I mentioned. And second, it will reduce the political economy problem. Let me explain briefly why these two effects would be. No, I cannot explain it briefly. Well, then what would this, to conclude, what this coordination would mean? And in a conclusive statement, it would mean a showing of leadership, much more than has been said before, but indeed show the European Union showing by way of a model, of an optional model, at least for member states to adhere to, that there is a benefit, an added value of having European Union in these epidemics, as opposed to not having the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio. Thank you for bringing in an analytical and economic perspective. I particularly appreciate your point about the externalities of closed borders from a personal perspective, because I'm here in Amsterdam and my partner is in Germany, and we can only see each other on Skype and Zoom for the moment. I give the word now, the last word, to Scott Greer. Scott.
Thank you for having me, and I hope everybody's well. In January, the World Economic Forum, Davos, made a big noise about a report on pandemic preparedness around the world, complete with all the accoutrement you do when you wish to shame countries where you could be different colors and a lighter color was better than a darker color. And it was very clear. The world's best pandemic preparedness was in the United States. Most of the rest of the countries with the world's best pandemic preparedness were in the European Union. If you missed it when Davos was trumpeting it, you might have seen it when Donald Trump waved it in the air as late as the end of March to tell Americans there was no problem. Going back to that report, it's possible to defend it, but the salient thing that you see is that the countries that got the nice colors don't look a lot like the countries that are currently doing a good job of managing the spread of the disease. In the case of the United States and Europe, you see one pattern that stands out, which is what you might call federal weakness, despite radically different starting points. In the United States, you've seen failures on multiple levels within the system. And as we've discussed in the European Union, what we see is it seems like the European Union is missing in action, that you have to go looking for the activities of the Commission and its leading politicians to see what they're doing in the public health sphere. And when you look for the European Union in general, what you tend to find are arguments about corona bonds. I want to try and exploit the United States-European Union comparison, not because it's necessarily the right approach, but because it's good to think with about some of the costs and benefits of creating a centralized shared capacity. The European Union and the United States are often more comparable than the European Union and its own member states. The European Union has enumerated powers. You can't do anything without treaty basis. That's much like the US federal government. As we have relearned, the states still have many of the basic powers to control your life and livelihood in the US. They're also incredibly complex political systems filled with veto points, and policymaking is almost necessarily reliant on a high level of creativity. They're both political systems in which undergraduate textbooks are particularly poor guides to what actually happens. The gap between theory and practice in EU-US policy is quite a lot larger than in, say, the United Kingdom or Spain. Now, in the United States, we have the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is ringed worldwide by essentially tribute organizations, the African CDC, the European CDC, an entire movement to create CDCs in every jurisdiction that's big enough to pay for a lab. And this reflects something structural in American federalism. You have 20,000 people working for CDC in Atlanta and Jakarta and elsewhere, precisely to permit underinvestment by local governments everywhere else. The logic of the United States is that the state of Michigan not only isn't going to run an epidemiological research station in Indonesia, it's probably going to even not spend enough money on things that matter to basic public health. And it can do that because CDC will fill in. So in the American model, the centralization and the huge resources on the federal level exist to allow states that are competing for tax bases and that are competing to cut their budgets to not invest. That means in turn that American functionality depends on federal leadership, and federal leadership depends on the White House, and Donald Trump is the president. That's essentially what's gone wrong in the United States. In Europe, you don't have that model. You have a model built on absolutely minimal coordination. Just compare the size of the ECDC, about 300 people, with the size of CDC, about 20,000 people. You have data, you have coordination of information. On a good day, as Anik pointed out, you might have coordination of communications. You also have the civil protection mechanism, which is an example of a common European Union model, which is essentially matchmaking. The basic concept of rescue and civil protection in practice is that I have a wildfire, you have surplus firefighting equipment, let's make a deal. It's not built on an actual response, let alone to a response to something that's hitting every country in the European Union simultaneously. It's a search for win-wins. How far can you go with a very small number of people and networks and matchmaking? This is, by the way, in contrast to zoonotic diseases. If COVID-19 were a disease affecting cows or pigs, you'd see a much more powerful European Union. But as soon as it crosses over into humans, the European Union becomes a much tamer and more restricted creature. Now, what are the advantages of the model, other than the enormous possibilities for glory for public health people who therefore write articles about how their own country should have something as excellent as CDC that they can then run? Well, there's a lot of them. It gives you a huge amount of capacity. Because if you pool all the 330 million odd Americans or 446 million Europeans requirements, you can run a very large lab for obscure diseases. So it's no accident the CDC is the center of reference globally for obscure things like hantavirus. It permits equity between jurisdictions. The Germans, the French might feel that they have sufficient capacity, but a lot of the smaller member states are under no illusions that they have the capacity in any level, epidemiological, lab, or anything else. They see the case for sharing resources. There's reduced destructive competition. And frankly, public health doesn't need to be that expensive or ambitious. You can pay for a good shared European model without necessarily committing yourself to redistribution or health system strengthening, and without spending necessarily that much money, because in the scheme of things, public health expertise is pretty cheap. And finally, it shows value. The European Union's in this fork, where the things it does and is good at and is built on are primarily to do with the market and the currency. And it's therefore always tempting to say that the way the EU can enter the hearts of its citizens is not with further deregulation, but with something useful, like making sure that everybody has adequate PPE in a pandemic. What's the disadvantage to centralization? You get the disadvantage of the governments you're talking about. In the case of the United States, this very beautiful system that I've laid out starts to crumble when you put Donald Trump in the White House. So Maria referred to Jean Monnet's famous quote about the European Union, which was, "Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for the crises." The EU has this history of failing forward, of doing the absolute minimum amount of integration to manage the last crisis, getting a lowest common denominator solution, and then being forced into a new shared crisis where there's a greater perception of shared disaster, and that was the timer telling me I should stop talking, a greater perception of a shared problem, and a new lowest common denominator solution. The two questions here are, one, will the member states perceive, it is a question of perception, whether they have a shared European problem over the 18 months that this go on? Secondly, how much of a European solution will they accept to a problem bigger than any we've had in 21st century public health history?
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for bringing in the comparative dimension, and thanks also for looking to the future. I mean, we might be curious in the Q&A to hear about why the CDC in the United States seems to have done so badly in terms of testing or developing a suitable test, which I'm not sure can be blamed on Donald Trump, even if almost everything else can be. Okay, so now we're going to have a round of responses. And since we've been very predictably running longer than I had hoped, I suggest each panelist take 1 minute and just make one point, whatever you think is the most important thing you want to say in response to the other panelists. So Maria, why don't you start?
Thanks. I will respond to Anik. Perhaps that's not surprising. Well, rather, I'd like to ask you, Anik. So I think that there's a need for clarification. First clarification needed are all the problems that you referred to, lack of communication, funds, enforcement of preparedness plans, are all these problems really problems that can be solved and should be solved with more legal powers? Aren't a lot of these problems something that could be achieved without any legal change at the moment? Like there is, for instance, an EU stockpile for for medicines already, right? And communication, is that something that member states would have to improve, or do we need legal change for that? Second question would that be, are we talking about treaty change? Are we talking about change of, European secondary law? Thanks.
Perfect, Maria. So Anik, you have your cue.
Okay, so there's a lot of legal nitty-gritty there that I'm not going to get into too much. For some things, we don't need more legal powers. It's true that the EU can already create a stockpile, but it would need more money to do that. rescEU, I think, now it was something like 50 million to buy some equipment, which is really, pales in comparison to what you would need in order to just buy vaccines or antivirals or things like that. So we do have, of course, within the health context, also the ability for public procurement and creating stockpiles, or for instance, for creating advanced purchase agreements, which is where you have a rolling agreement with a pharmaceutical company to ensure that you have the vaccines once, the disease is there. And there, currently, the member states have chosen for very much a contractual type of system that is very voluntary and based on sort of horizontal intergovernmental system. There, of course, you could definitely give the European Commission more power. And I would think that this would be possible on the current legal basis. Now, when it comes to, do we need treaty change for everything? No. So just generally, no, not for everything. I think there are other areas where you might want more coordination or even more harmonization of national public health laws, and the EU currently doesn't have that type of power.
Thank you, Anik. Alessio, you have your minute now.
Yes, thank you. Well, I want to bring some different perspective here. Just on the statement, this is big. It's much bigger than anything that's been mentioned so far by all the other speakers, I'm afraid. It's not about health. It's not nearly about something as small as the budget for healthcare in any country of the world. We're speaking about something that this year will lead between 10 to 30% to the world GDP. And the reason why it's doing this, because the only way we know how to contain, not even to stop this, for the time being, is something that costs that much. So we can speak about nitty-gritty detail, we can speak about politics and anything you want, but when we are hitting on something that big as 30%, even 10% is big enough of the world GDP, this will create, and is going to create, so much pressure on government to release measures, to do things, perhaps the wrong things, and fuel the externalities that I mentioned, that I think it's a strong call for action, whether it's legal or not, is of secondary importance.
Thank you. Next week, we'll be talking about the specific economic and social policy response to the crisis, which of course is a big part of the story of this 30%. Scott.
I want to second what Alessio said, that it's fun to talk about treaty changes, but the same Article 168 that's written to very much constrain the European Union is full of shall complement, shall encourage cooperation language. But equally, that means that if the member states make that decision, they can do it. And I think we're in more or less the definition of a critical juncture in the politics of a lot of countries around the world, including this tennis court oath environment that the way many of our political elites are thinking doesn't seem obviously suited to the situation at hand. So the question that I would say is, just like in the economic realm, to what extent will European countries think they have to work together to cope with the blow to their economies? In the public health realm, they can do it legally if they conclude that working together is the way out. And I would submit that there's no way you can operate any economy in the European Union without a far higher level of personal motion, and therefore a far higher level of trust and testing and coordination and competence than we see in the European public health realm now.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, now we're ready to take some questions. I can see the attendees list, and I'm happy that I see not only colleagues and students from the University of Amsterdam, but many friends and distinguished scholars from all over Europe and also North America. So please put up your hands if you would like to ask a question. Or send me a message in the chat. For the moment, I see one person who wants to ask a question. So I will recognize Yazid Zada. And Yazid, I'll also ask you just to introduce yourself very briefly and to be short and to the point.
Hi, everybody. My name is Yazid Zada, and I am a student at the University of Erasmus. My question is about the public opinion that it has been changing because of all the, I would say uncoordination between the, between the member states and the EU itself taking a slow, basically, decision to respond to the coronavirus. So my question is, where does this come into what's going to happen after the coronavirus is over? And how the EU itself will be responding to the public outcry. Thank you.
Okay, and now I see another question someone has submitted in the Q&A. So we have Louise van Schaik from Klingendahl, and so perhaps we can let Louise ask her question directly. If we unmute her. So Louise, you have the floor.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks for organizing this great webinar. I wanted to ask a question about how that would work with the purchase of a vaccine if it would become available. So how would European countries then cooperate? Would it make a difference if the vaccine would be developed within a European country or not? And also I saw that the EU has made a statement in the context of the World Health Organization that they want to go for, better availability and accessibility and low price basically of the vaccine so that it can be rolled out globally on a quick pace. But how exactly would it work? Because of course the vaccines are likely to be developed by pharmaceuticals. And how is that related to intellectual property rights and indeed the advanced purchase options? I would be really interested to hear your views on that. Maybe to Aniek, but maybe also Scott Greer would like to respond to that.
Okay, since I don't see other hands up at the moment, I want to give Aniek the floor. I mean, maybe you also want to tackle Yazid's question, and then maybe I give Scott also a chance to come in. But if the other panelists want to come in, just put up your hands either physically or virtually, and I'll take note of that. So Aniek, you have the floor.
So I think the question of Yazid was about sort of accountability afterwards, ex post accountability of the European Union for being late on its response. I think, well, we don't know about that. I think there will be a lot of questions asked about a lot of issues that might have gone better and might have gone wrong. I don't see sort of any kind of liability issues there because it's such a matter of politics. I don't know if that's what you were asking, if it was more on the legal side. But generally, I think, what we saw after swine flu, there was a large sort of effort on the in the EU, in the institutions of the EU, of evaluating what happened, and also all of these evaluations gave the basis for all kinds of new laws and new ways of working together. So if the EU is wise, it could use, never waste a good crisis, really use what happened here to create more efficient rules and procedures. Now to the question of Louise, very important. I mean, we can talk about the issues, of course, that Alessio has pointed out, but the fastest way to get out of this is to have a vaccine and to have working antivirals, because that is really sort of the main, that is, of course, we can, people will still get sick. We don't know about, immunity. There's still so much unknown. So really a vaccine could really do the trick. And it's right now, I've talked to people in the European Commission that are involved in this. And when it came to, so all the institutions, also the WHO, public health community, always thought it was going to, the next big thing, and that the next thing was coming was for sure for everybody. But the next big thing was going to be an influenza, not a coronavirus. And so public procurement is something that you can do and you can organize jointly. And the EU has quite a far-reaching system for doing this before the crisis. During the crisis, it's a lot more difficult. So what we now see in the EU is that the political level that is involved in the public procurement is a lot higher. Usually these are relatively low level, civil servants that are involved in this process. Right now, this is at the highest level of the ministries. They are involved in the public procurement process. Now, how would it make a difference, Louise asked, if this is done in an EU country? Yes, for sure. I mean, we've already seen that the EU has invested in development of a vaccine in Germany. Now, the vaccine development is one thing to invest in, but what you really want is access to the manufacturing plant, to the places. And this is really difficult because a vaccine is not made just in one country. So yes, you want to have control over that within your territory. And for the EU, it would be great if this is only in the EU, but there's a large chance that a large part of this will be, for instance, in India, where there's a lot of creation of medicines, etc. How do we get a reasonable price and accessibility globally? Again, only if you have control. Only if you have control. And I would imagine that even if the EU gets its member states together to really act solidary in this respect, then still it probably would be EU first and then the rest of the world. And I don't think the EU will be first, because we really do not have, I don't think, the main access to the manufacturing that you would need to get access on a large scale as quickly as possible. So I don't think we will be first in line.
Thank you, Aniek. I see, before I turn over to Scott, I see a question from Lisbeth Hoche from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the European University Institute, which follows on from that. So Lisbeth, would you like to come in?
I can. Good evening, everyone. I'm from Florence, so close to the epicenter where things started in Europe, at least. And it is indeed a follow-up question. As you probably will remember, there was this little crisis a few weeks ago when the head of the European Research Council, Mauro Ferrari, resigned because he claimed that he was trying to persuade the European Commission, or the ERC more specifically, to set aside some significant funding for the development of a vaccine, and received essentially a non-response. So my question is simply, did the EU miss an opportunity by not taking the lead on this? Would this, even if solely for political PR reasons, might this have made a difference in terms of profiling or centralizing, or perhaps appropriating more of a role for the European Union? By the way, Scott, I just want to also quickly say that I really enjoyed your comments and reminding us of these stark differences between the EU and the United States with respect to, the the expectations also from citizens where the leadership is going to come from in this crisis. I think that's an important thing for us scholars to remember when we're evaluating both the EU and national governments in how they're dealing with these crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth. So I'm going to give Scott a chance to respond. And then I think as we're running out of time, I will give a last word to Alessio and finally to Maria as the organizer of tonight's event. So Scott, please.
Without trying to summarize probably a single vein of research in political science on the European Union, I don't think it's ever really been driven by popularity. For a long time, its history was a popular acquiescence. So a better way to think about it is that it's going to emerge strengthened and useful to the extent that member state elites think that the European Union is a useful vehicle to rescue their own fates. And secondarily, to the extent that there is a perception among elites, but also, I guess, voters, that there is a shared fate. And what worries me is that how did we kick off the European place in the coronavirus debates with what more or less the chain of activities you would have engineered if you wanted to make Italians angry. They appeal for masks, they don't get masks, Christine Lagarde blows up their bond rating, and then we have a big argument about coronavirus featuring insults from the North directed at the South, and the South becoming increasingly angry, such as Pedro Sanchez's intervention. So if member state elites aren't convinced of the usefulness of the European institutions to solve a shared problem, and their publics are less convinced that it's a shared problem, that strikes me as the risk, both to getting something done in the public health area and, of course, to the future happy evolution of the EU.
Thank you, Scott. Alessio, a quick word.
Yes, I hope Annick is right that, or at least she's right in her hope that the vaccine will come and solve all our problem. If that was foreseeable, all economic model will say that this is a dominant strategy to lock down every country until the vaccine is found, because that will be both economically efficient and save the most lives. But we can't bet on this because we're not sure that actually we'll have a vaccine ever, if on time. That being said, I think the only way forward is some coordination, preferably global. Global would be utopistic, but at the EU level, not having coordination will create not only a probable failure of the whole construction on economic grounds, but also a lot of unrest. And I truly hope this will not be the outcome. Thank you.
Maria, I want to give you the last word here.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks everybody who participated and asked questions and listened to us. I think that one last point I'd like to emphasize is to second Scott in sort of emphasizing that in the end, it will be decided by the way that European leaders perceive that it is in their interest to seek a European solution. But I want to differentiate, and that is where I'm not myself clear about yet. Is it European leaders or is it European publics or sort of national publics? So I wonder, what influences the thinking of European, let's say, national leaders right now in how they communicate their their responses and the role of the EU. And they're not communicating about the EU. They are only showcasing their own action and completely ignoring the role of the EU in this. And what is needed to change that? And to what extent do they have to shape public opinion and not be shaped by what they perceive the public opinion to be?
Thank you, Maria. As we can see, this great discussion on public health and the public health response to the pandemic opens out questions about the social and economic policy response. It opens up questions about the national politics and the relationship between national and European politics. There's also a global geopolitical dimension, and we can all assume that there are going to be very powerful consequences for the future of the European Union, European integration. And so we will explore those in sequence over the coming 4 weeks. I hope to see many of you who I can see in the attendee window in future weeks. Please share the message with your friends and colleagues and students. And let me say that the recording, the video of this event should be on YouTube probably by this time tomorrow evening. And so also if you have to miss one of the episodes when it's broadcast live, you should be able to find it on YouTube. So let me conclude by thanking the panelists and the audience for this first experimental virtual visions of Europe. And I hope to see you next week, same time, same place. Good night.